presenting to us today. So without further ado, let me allow Dr. Marc Finn to get us started.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for the generous introduction and for the invitation to present to all of you. I thank you, Dr. Gukurume, and I'm very happy and delighted to be here. So if ever there's an issue with my audio or the slides, please let me know, because I've switched over to look at just my slides, so I can't see the chat and I can't see any of you. But it's really nice that I can give this talk, and I'll try to keep it to about 40 minutes so we can have some time for dialogue and engagement after. And as you can hear from my accent, I'm a South African living in the US, right? And I think the kernel of this talk and my ambition to bring informality to a more planetary kind of stage, both in scholarship and in practice, I think comes through, trying to navigate being a South African living in the US. And I'm at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And one thing that I constantly find myself trying to do here is trying to convince people that informality actually matters, right? So that's some of the staging for my work. Not only does it matter to sustainability in terms of the social arm of sustainability, but also that it matters as a driving force of global social, spatial, and economic transformation. So that's the kind of underpinning of today's talk, and it's titled The Political Economy and Process of Informality. So we've got a lot of theoretical work to get through, and then we've got some empirical cases that I do. And when I say empirical cases, I think you should try to conceive of this, how I understand a case, in a broadest possible sense, right? For me, a case is not just something localized to the individual scale. It's something that talks to a much broader process. And so those are some of the themes that we're going to get in today. So in mainstream urban planning, developmental, and even sociological discourse and research, we often currently view informality as a localized site-specific issue, confined to the margins of cities. It's treated as a peripheral remnant of incomplete development, the waiting room for development, that people are informal while they wait to be formalized. And I think that this framing misunderstands informality and treats it as kind of an outcome of just this endogenous process within cities. So if you imagine that it's this critique to be correct, I think it's because it completely fails to capture how global capitalism, and in my case an interest, the green transition, actually operate. If we go further, I think we first need to precisely define what informality is, right? And I'm committed my career so far, and I aim to do this for as long as I work, is to critically engage with the idea of informality. That is the kind of theoretical and applied animus that drives my work forward. It's not simply the absence of formal regulation or temporary marginal state of being. Rather, it's a dynamic organizing logic and structural outcome actively produced through state and industrial practices of selective enforcement, contradictory regulation, and systemic exclusion. And this happens across space and across time, right? So the issue of scale, temporal and spatial scale, as it informs informality in this planetary kind of sense, is really important. So informality is forged through socio-political, economic, and spatial processes that force people to live and work without formal recognition, occupational protections, or recourse when things go wrong. Think labor exploitation, think climate change induced flooding. There's no recourse when things go wrong. Despite these extreme and brutal constraints, informality also simultaneously provides, in many cases, the only generative livelihood opportunities available to people. So this paradox, right, between the brutality of constraint and the brilliance of improvisation and the necessity that it creates, is something that I think is really important when we think about informality. Not to romanticize it in any sense, but also not to strip people of the agency that they have. It may be constrained agency, but it is agency nonetheless. So I'm talking about a structural understanding of informality that extends beyond the individual scale. And the reality as I argue with Dr. Elman Banduako in our recently published paper in Progress in Human Geography, is that informality is not peripheral, right? It's dynamic planetary scale process. Now let's think about that. How can I back up the argument that informality is not peripheral, right? 61% of the global workforce is employed informally, according to the International Labour Organization. The United Nations estimates that by 2050, 3 billion people will live in informal settlements or in slum or slum-like conditions, as they refer to it. So as we argue in our work, to imagine informality as peripheral is to mistake marginalization with marginality. Marginalization is a process upon which people are forced into the informal sector or respond to their neglect and structural exclusion through informality. But this is not a marginal reality. So that's the kind of the hook that I want to set the stage up for when it comes to this talk. And this, brings out that point around marginalization versus marginality. And it really speaks to the kind of structural argument that I'm trying to get to. It might not be captured in formal GDP. People may not be formally taxed. We might not know the exact enumeration of all these people everywhere. But that does not mean, just because we can't see it or track it that well, that it is not happening across time and space. So this brings me to this paper, which really sets the stage for today's talk with Elman Banduako, a brilliant assistant professor at University of Alberta. And in this paper, we start off by giving a critique of what scholars embrace as theory from the South, as well as post-colonial urban studies. That's not to say that we're not indebted to what they call Southern theorizing. And it's not to say that we have not learned a tremendous amount from post-colonial urban studies. But I think in this argument, we purposefully ask scholars not to theorize from the global South because we think that that provincializes the political potential of the scholarship around informality. So we want to take informality and expand it to a planetary kind of sense, because when we try to distinguish it across geographies, I think we lose the links on how the global South underpins so much of what happens in the global North and how they are dialectically related, right? Dialectically related in the sense, I mean, what happens somewhere is inherently related to what happens elsewhere. Any act of consumption, say in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I am, is necessarily an act of production elsewhere. So we need this process-oriented view, which extends beyond the individual localized case and extends it across planetary space to try to understand those relations. And they have certain socio-spatial and economic forms. And so when we try to provincialize urban theory or informality theory and strictly kind of tie them to specific localized spaces, I think we risk retreating in a new kind of particularism that limits the explanatory potential of theory. So if we are truly to understand global socio-spatial transformation over the 21st century, we cannot just study difference for its own sake, right? We deliberately need to untether informality from specific geographies to dismantle and challenge what I see as essentialist binaries. Informality is a generalized planetary phenomenon, and our theoretical registers cannot be limited to this localized scale. So to bring this down to earth and operationalize this reality, Elman and I structure the concept of informal infrastructure. And we see this as a bridge between two dominant modes of urban and geographical theory. On the one hand, you have planetary urbanization, which I'll get into a little bit. And on the other hand, you have post-colonial urban studies. So while planetary urbanization is really adept and good and interesting in terms of trying to get us to think across scale, in terms of space particularly, post-colonial urban studies is really good at showing kind of the localized interrelations and effects of, say, informality within informal settlements in this regard, or related to informal labor. Now we wanted to bring this together through this term, informal infrastructuring, by tying the structural kind of argument around informality, but also expanding and deprovincializing the study of informality itself. Now, informal infrastructuring is built around this conceptual framework that we call the 4 Ps: people, place, process, and politics. And we use infrastructuring as a deliberate kind of choice. It's a gesture to assemblage urban studies. It's a gesture to post-colonial urban studies, where we, take seriously the labor of people on the ground. But we also use this as an active verb to shift our analytical attention away from static formal objects, right, towards the actual everyday actions that people take to build and connect their world. So the 4 Ps: people, place, process, and politics, right? So people can be understood as the connective tissue of infrastructure when thinking about informality. So when the government fails to provide basic services, it is people who rely on trust, shared labor, and mutual support to patch together ways to survive and hopefully move towards the pursuit of upward mobility. They are the ones building and maintaining the systems of daily life. Now, the next one is place. This is about the physical reality of informality. And it's also not just tied to the global south. Increasingly, we see the informalization of spaces in the global north linked to the housing crisis, linked to the ongoing poverty problem that is shared across the global north and south because of exclusionary processes like extremely high rent prices, for example. So place is not just about, informal settlements, right? It's where people create real self-built neighborhoods that physically reshape the map of the city. And I think across the global south, when we think about the estimated 3 billion people living in informal settlements by 2050, that's half of the world's total urban population, by the way. And we understand that modelers have predicted that by 2100, 13 of the world's 20 most populous cities are going to be on the African continent specifically. We start to understand that our inherited models around what urbanization is, what cities ought to be, simply does not actually account for where the transformation is happening and specifically how it is happening, right? And to be able to do this and not tied just to the informal, one informal settlement, for example, we need to insert the idea of process into informal infrastructuring, right? And a lot of this talk revolves around that. It reminds us that this is an interconnected global chain. So I use supply chains in my work to make these kinds of arguments and show how informality is the process that can link a rural mining context where people are extracting raw materials or agriculture directly to the heart of the world's biggest cities. Every act of production, every act of consumption is an act of production somewhere else. And then the last is politics, right? It means these everyday actions are fundamentally about power. They aren't just acts of survival. In many cases, they are acts of survival, but they're not just acts of survival. They are also acts of political claim making, involving collective organizing and sustained action, and the fight for rights and recognition against institutions that either want to ignore informal groups or simply erase or evict them because they might be inconvenient. So we're going to focus mostly on the process in this piece, right? To truly understand what I mean by process, we must theoretically deprovincialize informality and break out of our geographically bounded views of the city. Now, if you think about a geographically bounded view of the city, a term that I'll leave you with is methodological cityism. It's almost as if you take an individual city or an individual informal settlement and you put like a glass bowl or dome on top of it, right? And you want to try to isolate what happens in that individual settlement. Now, there's obvious limitations to that. People need to get their food from somewhere. People need to get their materials, their technological devices. They need to get their energy from somewhere, right? So if we contain everything to the individual dome, we miss this broader interconnection that's happening everywhere. So when I talk about process, it comes back to the urban question specifically, which links to Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt's 2015 work on planetary urbanization, where they seek to blast open our theoretical understandings of the city and shift our analytical focus towards the urban process itself, right? Cities are not static pre-given entities, and we must explode our inherited assumptions about their boundaries. The urban is not just what we see in the cities, the buildings, the physical density, the settlement boundaries. Obviously, we need to take those things really seriously, and they have obvious localized cultural and historical differences from other cities. That goes without saying, right? However, we have to move towards understanding the whole metabolic system that sustains the city and is itself transformed through this process. So today, the argument kind of goes that the urban fabric is stretched across the entire globe, right? Operationalizing distal extraction zones and agricultural hinterlands to feed the metabolism. So informality is precisely what connects, in my view and in Elman's view, these planetary extremes, providing the essential global inputs, the raw labor engine of global decarbonization, for example, that links distal hinterlands directly to the heart of all cities. So if we think about, my critique of assemblage urbanism, right? Assemblage urbanism can be kind of defined as a flat ontology, whereby assemblage urbanists or assemblage geographers are interested in how things relate to one another. And I think this is really good for helping to describe a rich kind of ethnographic description of who is living where, what the materials are made of, how things relate to one another. But sometimes I think it focuses too much on that thick description without kind of linking it up to a broader critique of how that came about or why people live in certain contexts, right? So how do we study planetary connectivity without just describing street level complexity? So urban studies has been heavily influenced by assemblage theory and this flat ontology, which focuses on horizontal networks of human and non-human actors. It gives an agency to everything, right? An equal kind of agency to the person on the street, the person in the government, but also to non-human actors, right? The building, the materials. And for me, I think this misses the mark somewhat. I'm interested in agency. I think that people do have agency, but I don't think that everyone has equal agency, partially because people have different amounts of capital. They have different amounts of political influence. So while assemblage theory offers an incredibly valuable tool, particularly for its thick description of everyday life, it excels at capturing, the sheer complexity and the messiness, the vibrant everyday connections on the ground. So it helps in that sense to give a rich portrayal of how, in my case, informal settlements physically come together. However, I think we need to kind of lobby a little bit of a critique at it. So while it is richly descriptive, treating it as a kind of a foundational understanding of the urban question or of the metabolism is problematic because it is fundamentally delinked from political economy. So to take it to a South African example, an assemblage theorist might be able to try to understand any given informal settlement in South Africa. And when they provide this kind of flat ontology, I think they miss the issue of scale, right? The issue of scale, and in terms of a temporal sense, like history, South African history, and I've written extensively on how urban planning has been used as a tool not only to separate racialized groups in South Africa, but purposefully to reproduce inequality across racialized groups, and then to point at those inequalities which were politically created, and then use it as further justification for further separation in South Africa through the apartheid and pre-apartheid system. For me, that's a temporal scale that we need to understand. And if we think about a spatial scale in the South African case, we need to think about, okay, let's think about pre-apartheid South African urbanization, whereby an incredible amount of principally male labor, black labor, was brought to Johannesburg and to Gauteng to extract gold for the world economy. This is responding to burgeoning demand around the world for both gold and diamonds, and it acts as a migratory kind of magnet for people who both move and are compelled to move to extract gold and diamonds for the global market. This is the spatial scale on the South African lens. So I think that assemblage theorists miss this in trying to flatten or give the equal kind of agency to all different actors. And so the scale question helps me talk about political economy more broadly, right? And I think if we only rely on a descriptive focus, it leads to what Andrew Sayer calls a chaotic conception. So in simple terms, we may assume that the messy facts of a local neighborhood simply explain themselves, and arbitrarily lumping together the unrelated while missing, or the marginally related, while missing the hidden transnational mechanisms of power that structure everyday life. And I think to actually explain informality, we need to reject this flat ontology. This is a direct challenge to assemblage scholars, and done in good faith and in the spirit of mutual dialogue. I think what we need is what Sayer terms rational abstraction, which require us to isolate essential structural properties, the generative mechanisms and their structural function as they relate to global capitalism, rather than getting lost in the chaotic surface level descriptions of a localized area. A rational abstraction cuts through the noise to isolate the underlying individual engines of global capital that force these informal spaces to exist in the first place. And our 4Ps framework serves as a necessary tool to try to highlight these core structural forces. And it tries to reshape our understanding of informality, not just on a political lens, but also as a form and function of global capitalism. How do we anchor these abstractions in the real world? And to do this, I think we can draw on Michael Burroway's work. The goal is to uncover in his work the macro foundations of micro processes. So his work in the 1990s provides the blueprint, 1960s, sorry, provides the blueprint for this. He studied what he called Zambianization in the copper belt shortly after independence from the British. So Burroway used deep micro-level observations to uncover how management of Zambian mines used shadow roles to keep white supervisors in power over newly promoted black Zambians. Crucially, Burroway did not stop at describing the localized shop floor or mine context. He used what he calls the extended case method, which demanded that he trace the micro processes of everyday interaction upward, a vertical kind of integration of the micro process, revealing that the local color bar in Zambia was structurally maintained by massive transnational forces, specifically multinational copper corporations, leveraging the newly independent government's dependence on copper revenues. So Burroway shows us that you cannot understand the daily sweat and tension of workers without tracing it vertically to the political elites in the global economy. What he calls the vertical structuration is exactly what we need to engage with to understand informality. So as informal settlements are not self-contained horizontal networks, they are localized physical manifestations of global forces, such as supply chains, such as long-term exclusion, whether that's through a colonial imposition in Zambia and its relationship to mining, whether it links to South Africa's history of pre-apartheid and apartheid too, as they manifest in the relationship between gold and diamond mining and human migration and urban settlement. But I also want to critique scholars on the planetary urbanization side who are heavily influenced by a Marxist understanding of labor. They call this the reserve army of labor, which for me misses a fundamental point about human agency, coming back to this initial tension that I outlined in the beginning. People are not just a reserve army of labor. They are actively challenging their own dispossession. And they are actually actively trying to pursue upward mobility, not simply waiting for that kind of development. So informal infrastructure acts both as a critique of these two different methodological framings, but also principally as a bridge between them, not to throw either of them out the window. So how do I do this and apply this in my own work, right? This is not just a theoretical discussion. I think there are practical and applied applications for trying to understand and challenge this theory. And I do this through two different nodes in my work: artisanal and small scale, as well as industrial mining of cobalt and copper in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as electronic waste and urbanization in Agbogbloshie, Ghana. So let's start at the beginning of the supply chain. Around 45 million people in the world work as artisanal and small scale miners. Around 250 to 270 million people rely or work indirectly or directly in artisanal small scale mining. This is the leading non-farm form of labor and income in much of the world. However, it's often framed as kind of a nuisance to global development or a side issue when it comes to supply chains. And part of this is how we understand that marginalization versus marginality issue, right? Industrial mining for the green transition and for our everyday electronics, upon which cobalt and copper are essential, provides around 20% of global cobalt for supply for lithium-ion batteries, for electric vehicles, for windmills, etc. However, it employs the vast majority of the mining workforce itself. So when you have 20% of supply, but have 90 to 95% of the workforce, you have to ask, what is marginal in this case? It's not just about output, right? It's about employment. So in the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, around 200,000 people work as ASM miners, and they face long-term dispossession. So in my work on Lubumbashi in the south of the DRC, I look at how that dispossession is created, right? You have to go back to 1890 when Leopold II, the Belgian king, owned the whole of the Congo, so the Congo Free State, so much as a person can own a country, right? And he knew that Cecil John Rhodes was moving northwards in pursuit of the vast copper deposits of the Congo in the south. And he established a smelter in the early 20th century for this copper in an act of effective occupation. You can find that term in the 1885 Berlin Conference materials, where they gave rights to European nations to colonize and occupy certain African countries based on effective occupation, basically like a flag in the ground, only this is a smelter. This is ours, back off, right? So Leopold then held all this land and he gave concessions to these copper mining companies over the 20th century. That helped then allow and link Congolese copper to electrify the whole world. It was among the top 5 producers by the early 1920s and 30s. Now, if we trace this temporal scale across time, you can understand that those same concessions were owned by a Belgian company, UMHK, which held the Shinkologwe mine, upon which the majority of the uranium used in the Manhattan Project to drop those 2 bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from those concessions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now extend the temporal scale further. Let's think about cobalt today. Cobalt is a byproduct of copper mining. In many cases, people are mining artisanally the old waste and tailings from old colonial mines to then put them into global supply and then link them to our everyday consumption here. So this is a structural, temporally infused, multi-scalar understanding of how we get to artisanal mining in the everyday. And the basic idea around, you can understand as informal mining or artisanal mining, is that risk is concentrated downwards onto the majority of people working informally, facing exceptional occupational issues and social environmental degradation, right? While value capture goes upwards through the supply chains, which then are processed and refined around the world, concentrated in China, and then consumed by all of us. There's obviously major consumption disparities across the global north and south. But it's trying to link informality to these supply chains and understand how they are socially and spatially and as well as economically produced and linked to these supply chains. And recently published a piece called Transformative Cohabitation in Energy Research and Social Science, which tries to bring a critical geography lens on informality to the mining space specifically. And transformative cohabitation is kind of like a way to frame interventions into mining, which is influenced by this fundamental understanding that informality exists in a very complex world of paradoxes, right? And this is bringing an urban lens to the conversation too. Now, this paradox comes back to what I said initially. Informality enables people the livelihood opportunities in the short term, right, that they rationally take, because alternative opportunities provide less income or are totally unviable, right? That's the short-term part of the paradox. The long term is that many times this type of labor exposes people to extreme levels of toxicity, to environmental destruction over the long term. And the additional layer to the argument on informal paradox is that the short-term gains that they get in terms of electronic waste production and recycling and processing in Ghana, people use that extra income to then mitigate those long-term harms. So in my scholarship, I'm always interested in trying to embrace the discomfort or the gray areas of sustainability, as I like to call them, and try to really treat people with the respect that they and their work deserves. This means understanding that people are taking rational choices to earn an income, to help provide income and livelihood opportunities for themselves, their family, and their communities, while not shying away or romanticizing those actions. So this piece, published in a Nature Portfolio journal, Urban Sustainability, takes this issue really seriously. Now, part of my work, I mentioned, is to bring a political economy approach to informality. Another part of my work is to try to mainstream scholarship on informality, is trying to respond to my frustrations in the US that people do not take informality seriously enough. So not only to tie it to sustainability, that's why I founded the Informal Sustainability Lab, but to get all different types of scholars and methodological practitioners to start engaging with it, to try to, not only understand why people work in informality and to support them, but also to try to think of new approaches in order to pursue that. And transformative cohabitation is one such example. And another paper with a specific urban angle with Elman Banduaka, we call it supported self-provisioning, right? It's this idea that people use incredible ingenuity to create these livelihood opportunities for themselves. But we cannot only rely on bottom-up interventions to take people out of the poverty that they had no hand in creating in the first place. So how do we do this in Ghana? I spoke a little bit about mixed methods, and I understand that I'm going a little bit over time, but if it's okay if I can finish this in the next couple of slides. So what we did was we looked at 200,000 buildings around Agbogbloshi, one of the world's biggest electronic waste recycling and processing plants, entirely informal. And I did 55 interviews in Agbogbloshi and came up with this idea from the interviews that people are working within this informal paradox. And I spoke to my colleague, Dr. Demetrios Gunnaridis, and said, is there a way for us to try to quantify this? So he looked at these 200,000 buildings that you see here, and then used remote sensing mechanisms and methods to try to understand the relationship between urbanization and exposure to PM 2.5. And over 20 years, we found that the relationship started out really negative. So you had increased urbanization without increased exposure to toxic plumes and soot in the air. And it became very strong positive, especially in the Agbogbloshi zone. So that then speaks to the informal paradox where people are accessing opportunities. They're using urbanization as a means. It's a mostly migrant community to work in the informal e-waste community. And they're doing this, and they know that this exposes them to long-term harm. And I have a short conversation piece that's coming out soon, which kind of summarizes those principal findings. And in the piece, we criticize the kind of naive assumptions around sustainability and the circular economy as being inherently just, the circular economy as being inherently sustainable, right? It's informal workers that that extract the cobalt and copper at the start of the supply chain. We then consume them everywhere else in the world, and then 15% of the world's electronic waste, including a lot of copper and cobalt, is then dumped in countries like Ghana. Now, to link the supply chain to the physical manifestation of these toxic circular economies. Public health scholarship has found elevated levels of heavy metals, including copper and cobalt, not only in the soil and water around Agbogbloshie, but also in people's blood and urine. Now, Ghana does not have any notable deposits of cobalt, right? So we have a supply chain where 76% of it is produced from one area in the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it literally ends up in the blood of people at the end of those supply chains. And yet we have this really burgeoning informal settlements of Agbogbloshie as well as Old Fadama, where people are rationally moving to this area in order to access the economic opportunities associated with electronic waste. So informal workers are the ones not only that are making the circular economy circular in the first place, they're having the risks kind of pushed down and they are internalizing those risks. And then they are creating value wherein that circular economy then takes the copper and cobalt from e-waste and then puts it back into global circular supply chains. So in my work on reconceptualizing informality, this is some of the ways that I'm trying to reconceptualize it, from a localized to a planetary understanding, from a static survivalist understanding of informality to a dynamic and processual one, where we look at those kinds of sustainability gray spaces, from a marginalized sector to a structural one. It actively is making the world around us. It's not just what we see in individual places, right? It's the process and the politics that help inform that. What I call the informal-formal dialectic in my own work on Zambia, that industrial companies, in this case, mining companies, are actively creating the conditions upon which informal responses and world making are necessary to create livelihood survival opportunities, right? They are not separate. It's not only that they are not a binary, it's that they are mutually co-constitutive. They make each other. And I do this a lot in my work in the Democratic Republic of Congo now, and my work on artisanal mining. And I think traditional approaches want to eradicate or formalize the informal sector. And I'm developing a series of different types of interventions. One is transformative cohabitation, another is supported self-provisioning. I have another in the works on urbanization itself, which is hybrid models which understand the constraints of informality, but also try to work with rather than against what I think are the major kind of dynamic forces shaping global transformation. And this is an industrial mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is the same supply chain very nearby to where the initial photo was taken, where you have the mineral processing of copper and cobalt, and then these copper and cobalt buying houses in the Democratic Republic of Congo, wherein the supply chain kind of merges in China at the refinement areas, where then these minerals then go into global supply chains and then are dumped in Ghana, Nigeria, China, elsewhere for informal workers and communities to deal with. So for me, informal labor really underpins this debate, right? Informality both subserves global capitalism, but it also subverts it. Subserves it, it provides, cheap labor wherein these materials are then made circular and recirculate back into global supply chain. There are informal settlements where, maybe the state is not providing the necessary rights and support for people, but they still provide these people, in the case of Agbogbloshie, still provide critical inputs for the global economy. So that's subserving it. But it also offers the opportunity to subvert it in some ways, to create new forms of labor connections, as well as kind of prefigurative ideas around how cities can and ought to function, where they actually attend to the basic needs of everyone. And the piece on transformative cohabitation decouples formalization as an intervention from basic human rights. I don't actually have an issue in principle with formalization over the long term if it actually benefits people, right? But in the short term, I think it just cuts people out of their basic livelihood opportunities. So informal infrastructuring brings together what others may see as separate cases across time and space. And I think supply chains help us critique the moral geographies wherein, just because something is distantly located from us, it's far away from us, doesn't mean that it's not interconnected for us. It does not mean that, at least in the US, we don't have a moral responsibility to the people underpinning those supply chains. I think it points to new methodological and normative ways forward. And it tries to argue that informality is produced over time and across space. And I think that paradox, the brutality of constraints and the brilliance of individual acts of agency is also something to think about over the long term. I think a multi-scale imaginary is a prerequisite for a more planetary understanding of informality. And I think my work is trying to be ambitious, because I think we need new debates on scale theory and interventions when it comes to informality. I think scholarship on informality has been spinning its wheels for a little bit too long, and part of that is because we treat it as an endogenous case, right? We treat it as a self-evident case in one individual settlement, rather than being linked to much broader kind of temporal and spatial scales. So before I wrap up, and thank you for letting me go a few minutes over time, this is a recent commentary that I published in Dialogues in Human Geography on this concept of autogestion, or radical self-management, a term from Henri Lefebvre. Right, and I open the piece by asking, what are the stakes of informality scholarship? Are scholars taking informality seriously enough to consider how it is shaping and will likely continue to shape the socio-spatial, economic, and political concerns of the 21st century in countless but often quiet ways? Do the urgency and dynamism of informality matter to scholars, or are we mostly interested in repeating well-trodden arguments among ourselves from the ivory tower? This is a critique directly aimed at scholars for kind of not really approaching informality with the urgency in our scholarship to represent the urgency of the actual chain that is unfolding across planetary space. So I kind of advance this position that we must build more ambitious research platforms that do justice to the informal processes that shape the central questions of our time. We must go beyond standalone thick description towards structural critique, from endogenous case studies to cross-scalar relational and theoretical analyses, and from the ivory tower to the ground of the everyday that forms part of our constitutive whole. The political study of informality, this is responding to a lot of work that Elman Bandwako and I have done, holds great potential in this regard, especially if it builds on the radical premise that ordinary people everywhere hold the key to challenging repression and inequality. So that comes to the constraint and the agency question. Thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to present to all of you. Thank you to Dr. Gukurume for this invitation. As I mentioned, you can find me over email or on LinkedIn, and that is my lab's website, the Informal Sustainability Lab. I'm going to stop the sharing and I'll return to the meeting room. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brandon, for that fascinating talk and very important work that you are doing there. Something that's also very close to my own research interests on informality. But I like how you sort of combine critical minerals, spatial scholarship, urban geography, and informality in the same way. That's very interesting. Maybe let me open up to questions, comments from colleagues. I see Isaac. Maybe we can take about 2 or 3 questions. I see Obvious as well. In that order, maybe we can take about 4 questions and then we take the second round. So Isaac and Obvious.
Thank you, Brenton. I hope you can hear me, Simba.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. This was a really great presentation, and you are doing a lot of great work. So that's very fascinating to hear you talking about all this. I much, but just to maybe connect you. You might already know this actually, but there's one of my colleagues who is working on this work that you are doing, who is Professor Singumbe Muyeva. He's Zambian originally. Maybe you already know him, but he just published a book apparently by the University of Michigan Press, the homeowner ideology, economic futility of real property rights in 4 African cities. and those the cities are Nairobi, Cape Town, Lusaka, and Rwanda. So it's quite he researches a lot more on the informality and of course informal settlements as well, and then he links that to housing. So that might be something to interesting, to inform all the work that you are doing. But my second question is related to the methodology that you are using. Have you been to all these cities that you are talking about, or you because I heard you talking about using the satellite method to see the informality in some of the pictures that you're showing. I just wanted to know that and how that is informing your research.
Thank you, Isaac. Maybe let's take Obvious and then we'll take the second round. Obvious, maybe you can throw in.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting and insightful presentation. I just wanted to ask a question. I like the way you are framing the question of informality as a kind of planetary issue, not just an African issue or an issue that has to do with the third world, right? I think that is quite exciting. So, I mean, I'm interested more in how, because I see the case studies are also from the Global South. I'm interested to see how, informality then perhaps, is operating in the Global North, and perhaps what kind of comparisons, similarities, differences you can draw from this particular, these particular observations in cities in both in the Global South and in the Global North. I'm saying this because I remember from the work of other scholars that some people who have observed a city like Lagos with all the informality and the urban challenges have made a pronouncement that in fact Lagos is the city of the future. That all of us, the world is gravitating towards Lagos, given what is happening there in terms of all the urban challenges, including issues of informality and so forth and so forth. So I'd be interested in, how the data, the empirical material from the Global South speaks to the empirical material from the Global North in a little bit more detail. Perhaps it's a project for the future, but perhaps you can, give some insights into that. And again, also, I'm interested in understanding, the place of perhaps theoretical ideas around improvisation. All of us, all cities, perhaps have to rely on improvisation in one way or another. And informality is a way through which, urban residents somehow have to make do, to improvise. Not necessarily saying that you should go back to the survivalist kind of approach to the stand of informality. But I think all of us, given that we are gravitating towards Lagos, for instance, there's a way in which we ought to improvise to make life, to make life work for us wherever we are, whether it's in the Global South or in the Global North. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, Brandon, maybe you can respond to this and we'll take a second round of questions.
Sounds good. Thank you, Isaac and Obvious, for those really good, interesting and provocative questions. Let me answer the first one first, right, on methodology. And I think this is, I mentioned that I'm interested in critiquing both sides of that debate on planetary urbanization as well as post-colonial assemblage-related kind of scholarship. And one of my critiques of planetary urbanization is that it's not necessarily or sufficiently engaged with what is happening on the ground, right? I think it's not actually accounting for the people part of that 4Ps process that I'm talking about. And so, yes, I am really on the ground as a scholar, right? My work, I started as a qualitative, more kind of case specific or case oriented type of researcher. So in Ghana, I have a long track record of qualitative work. They're working with the local communities as well as the Accra Metropolitan Assembly. And something that I found about doing multiple rounds of interviews is that I want to be able to take what we see as what we may present as an individual case and then look at the macro foundation, right? That's why I'm interested in supply chains. because I'm interested in the informal settlements of Agbabloshi and Old Fadama in Accra and their relationship to e-waste. But I also want to link it to transnational flows of how that e-waste got there in the first place. That's why I'm interested in cobalt mining in Democratic Republic of Congo, but also in national governance, right? It's the Ghanaian government that enables the inflow of those materials, which are in many cases illegally exported from the US or from Germany and labeled used or usable electronics, right? But it's actually just dumping in the global south under that kind of mislabeling of the shipping containers. So we inherently within this kind of formulation, we have a global process. So I need to be able to try to understand this global process as it relates to the case that I'm interested in. So working with the remote sensing scholars, that gives me a way to try to understand or more generalize the type of arguments that are emergent from the ground. And I have done also 3 rounds of fieldwork in the Democratic Republic of Congo with industrial and artisanal small-scale miners. And I think having an ongoing presence on the ground helps to inform my theoretical account, right? And oftentimes I present in my scholarship these as you know, kind of standalone, because you know you can't do everything in every paper. But in terms of my theoretical understanding and the things that I'm trying to push forward in my work, they necessarily need to be seen together. And informality is the central concern that binds them together, binds the spatial production of informal settlements through supply chains, in my case. So I can critique the naive assumptions around the green transition or the circular economy, because we can tie these different inequalities which are produced over time and across space to the individual case itself. That's why Burroway's work is important to me. When it comes to Obvious's question around the global north, I think you touching on something that I'm really trying to get into more, right? To give the idea that it's not just the preserve or the concern of people living in poverty. It's not. It's also informality from above, right? If you think about crony capitalism and corruption, we have a totally different understanding of how informality operates and why it operates. From informality from below, say in the case of informal labor, informal settlements, I'm really trying to advocate for a much more empathetic understanding of why people work in the informal sector and how we can support them. When it comes from informality from above, different kinds of, you know, political elite or patronage networks, I'm very critical of informality in that concern, because people with capital and political power are dramatically abusing that kind of power, right? And when it comes to like practical examples, we have, you know, informal housing extensions in the US, in the UK. You have the development of like self-built encampments in Los Angeles, even, right? You have historical precedents in the UK, in the US, that kind of present informality as not really a place-based phenomenon. But you have self-built housing, you have the tiny house movement. PhD student Kapidi is really interested in that in the US. And this is something that people are using in a response to being structurally left out of the housing market associated with global economic inequality. And I think the big kind of issue that I'm interested in addition to, you know, the work that's happening, say, on the gig economy in the US or in Europe, where people are not given, you know, formal contracts, they're working 0 contract hours. You can kind of put that under the informal economy more broadly. But we also have to ask the question, at least in the US, as we have the major expansion of artificial intelligence, where you have companies in Silicon Valley that are literally trying to replace manual labor, right? They are developing approaches to try to cut out the working class populations within not only the US, but more generally, right? So we have to ask not only what will happen because of the job cuts, and that's an essential question to be asking. We need to ask, what will people do after their jobs are cut, right? So they're not just going to go back to, as in the Marxist sense, like a reserve army of labor. They're going to find new ways to respond to being cut out. And I think that is the real avenue moving forward, where we try to tie informality, not only obviously to the global south, but the movement, as you mentioned, the future of Lagos, I think there's something there to really think about when it comes to the global workforce too.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brandon, for your response. Yeah, see, George, I recognize you. Any more questions, comments, colleagues? Maybe I can. I see Crispin as well, and Tamuka. Yeah, so in that order, George, Crispin, and Tamuka, go ahead.
Thank you, Simba, and thank you, Brandon. I hope you can hear me. I'm happy that Brandon recognizes that informality is survivalist, and he is critical in his work of informality, because the way, for example, informality manifests itself on the African continent, it's a manifestation of failure. You know, because of the informality, for example, you have politicians in these parts, you have people who create myths, for example, about the township economy and things like that, things that do not exist, you know. But what I wanted to find out, as somebody who is interested in social movements, I wanted to find out in your conceptualization of the 4 Ps of informal structuring, people, place, process, and politics. I wanted to find out what are the in these places where you have looked at informality, is there any social movement activity that is related to this? How do social movements in these places you have studied engage with these notions of informality and survival and so forth? Thank you.
Crispin, and then Tamuka.
Oh, okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah, very interesting, Brandon. Quite very interesting presentation there, and how you sort of your framing of how we should understand informality. I think that's quite very interesting. So my question is around maybe that way of your sort of like this way of framing informality. How can that sort of like, in what ways maybe can that sort of the shaping of the sort of the question around governance, informality and governance is quite sort of like in a way one of the very topical issues. That sort of like way of framing, how, in what ways can it sort of like shape the way that governance in this particular sector? And then the question you touched on, the paradox in as far as informality is concerned, and one of which is the question about how we should understand agency in terms of maybe how the those who are engaged in the formal economy expresses agency. Is it a form of the question really in terms of the paradox that sort of like, I don't know if you can talk to, is it really how should we see this form of agency? Is it a form of resistance, or is it a form of trying to navigate and survive within the system? Yes, it's a form of agency, but what type of how can we sort of like in a way conceptualize or understand this form of agency? Is it about just navigating within the system, or about as a form of resistance, or trying to reconstruct the whole sort of like in a way the whole sector in relation to the stakeholders? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Crispin. Tamuka, and then I think we'll allow Brandon to respond.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brandon, and also thank you very much to the organizer. My question is very straightforward. I think Brandon has highlighted the issue of political economy of informality. So I just wanted to understand how now do we reconcile the need for order and structural transformation in cities with the danger that, you know, too much regulation could possibly create barriers to entry for the most vulnerable entrepreneurs. Thank you.
I think you're still muted, Brandon.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love those questions. Thank you so much, George, Crispin, and Tamuka. I think they really touch on some of the concerns of my work with Elman, and you know, this emerging body of scholars that are not only taking informality seriously, but trying to reinvent scholarship on it specifically. So if we come to social movements and politics, and I think this is, you know, related to Tamuka's question on how to govern informality, like how do we deal with the issues of constraints, the challenges associated with informality without there's a pragmatic realization that some intervention is necessary, right? I mentioned earlier that bottom-up kind of approaches to informality are not sufficient to get people out of the poverty that they had no hand in creating in the first place. And I think that's important. I do think we need both bottom-up and top-down interventions at the same time that actually take informality seriously and understand informal actors in a kind of a rational sense, right? That's why I'm so interested in informal paradox. If I were in that position where I needed to provide for my family and had faced, you know, in the case of Ghana, it's mostly a migrant community, to Agbogbloshi, where people have moved from the north of Ghana, which is experiencing conflict, where people face active issues of famine, right? People are migrating from Burkina Faso, from Benin, to Agbogbloshi, to the Iwe site, because they lack alternative economic opportunities. Agricultural outputs are declining in some cases because of climate change, right? This is also a scalar kind of argument for how and why people migrate to certain places. They're making the rational choice, however problematic it may be, to be able to try to provide livelihoods for themselves. And for me, that realization in the informal paradox is an attempt to try to empathize with that rationality, right? And when we try to empathize to that rationality and then scale it up, I think it also influences the type of interventions that at least I would like to see when it comes to informal settlements and informal labor. So I mentioned earlier the piece around supported self-provisioning with Elman Banduaka. I mentioned the idea around transformative cohabitation as it applies to mining. So the aim with these two kind of pragmatic policy-oriented approaches to informality is to look at that kind of empathetic understanding of the rationality of informality as a survivalist kind of approach to everyday life, and depart from previous interventions that are often commonplace. What are some of those different types of interventions? Well, on the one hand, you have a neoliberal kind of laissez-faire approach to informality, which kind of just treats it like it's not there, right? People can use their own agency to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and pursue upward mobility. You know, I think people have agency, but I don't think that kind of argument is good enough. I think it just kind of abandons people without any kind of responsibility, both from the local, the central government, and from kind of broader understandings of how the supply chains and people connect to each other across planetary space. Then we have other types of interventions, which are kind of just state brutality, right? Where people are evicted and displaced, whether it's from a mine or from an informal settlement in Agbogbloshi. Agbogbloshi has faced repeated rounds of eviction after brutal eviction, right? To try to deal with the e-waste issue. Artisanal small-scale miners face the brutal imposition of the Congolese government to try and militarize space, wherein people are, over more than 100 years, are displaced from the land that they use to live off of and to, in this case, extract minerals. They are evicted by industrial mining companies and have no other kinds of alternatives but to find a new way through artisanal and small-scale mining. And then it becomes a kind of a convenient excuse for these industrial mining companies to say, look at these artisanal miners, and they are real complexities associated with this, social environmental abuse and negative long-term harm associated with both artisanal and industrial mining companies. But if we look at those two together and you say industrial mining companies then use the displacement and the precarity that they created with informal artisanal miners, and they say, look at these artisanal miners, they are the problem with the supply chain. And I think that's a misframing of the issue in the same way that evictions of Agbogloshi, the informal settlement, don't actually deal with why people are doing what they're doing. So when it comes to supported self-provision, it comes back to this issue of kind of hybrid modes of governance where you work with, not against informality, right? It's a pragmatic understanding that informality is not going anywhere anytime soon. Whether you like it or not, I think we've seen repeated rounds of formalization in formal settlements or artisanal mining supply chains where it's, you know, the World Bank can spend $1 billion over 40 years on trying to formalize informal labor. We've only seen it increase, right? So we have to figure out pragmatic ways that work, that bridge bottom-up and top-down interventions, but also understand that formalization can and does cut people out of their livelihood opportunities because the barriers to entry are too high, the license for the permit is too high, the rent becomes too high when people have to kind of go into the formal system within informal settlement, and try to, you know, whether it's develop anticipatory infrastructure to try to guide better outcomes over the future, or whether it's trying to bring together industrial and informal actors to try to, you know, recognize that they are dialectically related. I think I've touched on some of the issues across all three questions. I guess social movements, you know, obviously I'm really attentive to not romanticizing informality, but, you know, in the piece with Elman Banduako, something that we need to develop further, I think, is this idea of politics, right? We draw on the ongoing work of Slum Dwellers International on WeGo. These are global networks of informal groups that are not only trying to, you know, advocate for informal groups, but they're actually actively documenting cases where people are enumerating themselves within informal groups, right? Because they know that they have some kind of power when they have documented themselves that they actually live here. They can't just be displaced. So that to me is quite an inspiring example. But then, you know, coming back to my point on the critique of the romantic notion, you also see when informal groups come together through political organizations, these organizations getting co-opted by political elites, right? The development of patronage networks, wherein the informal community groups don't necessarily serve the outcomes and the interests of all their members because they can get co-opted so easily. And I think that's kind of a further interesting paradox and challenge to the scholarship on political informality. And I think something that we need to really take seriously if we are to expand out the pragmatic notion that informal groups hold a certain political power. And when you understand that this political power is not just tied to the informal settlement or not just tied to individual artisanal mining of cobalt, I think we start having the beginnings of a new understanding of popular sovereignty through the study of informality itself.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brandon. I see maybe we start with Jealous, then Obvious and Crispin. And then I think I'll throw in my own as well towards the end. So Jealous, Obvious and Crispin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Brandon, and thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Mine is not a question, but it's more about a comment, because in terms of informality, yes, it's a planetary issue, but at the same time, in the global south or in the whole global south, it's informality coming from a governance. I'm coming from a governance perspective. Most of the global south, for example, in Zimbabwe, the issue of Operation Murambazvina and the issue of governance within cities, we see the ruling party loses its capacity, its role in the most of the primary cities and secondary cities in Zimbabwe, and it's trying to undermine the role of the opposition part which gained the ground in the ruling part without providing the necessary resources for them to provide, for example, affordable housing to the people. Then it expands some of the farms which were in the periphery of the city. Then it gives leases to the people and relocate people to those cities. But the Harare City Council, for example, it doesn't have the capacity to manage those cities. So the ruling party wanted to re-urbanization from, I take this from Asha Amini Kamete 2006 paper on re-urbanization of Zimbabwe. So the ruling party wanted to get, it's like vote buying. They wanted to vote, they want to regain their governance within cities, so they try to expand the city. So they want to govern it. So sometimes I can argue that informality is planetary at the same time, but it's heterogeneous in terms of place, process, and politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Jairus, for that. Obvious and Crispin, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Yeah, very interesting. I hear you speaking about care around not over romanticizing informality and all that. Just a quick question. In terms of your conceptualization of informality, where do you, I mean, maybe, I don't necessarily want you to put you in a box of some sort, but I know that, there's a group of thinkers who believe that, okay, yes, informality is actually an attempt by people to live with collapse. They're referenced as collapsologists. People were saying, okay, yes, this is actually an attempt by people to live with collapse in a kind of apocalyptic environment and all that, characterized by decline and collapse of industrial civilization. But there's also another group which is more hopeful, right? To say, well, I mean, there's hope at the end of the day. It's not about just living with collapse, but it's actually about regeneration and creating an alternative world. So I don't know where, if you had to look at these two extremes, where do you fall in terms of your analysis of informality, without necessarily saying, okay, you over-romanticize it or that you become apocalyptic in orientation. I'm interested in where your analysis falls, given what I've said already, that in fact, that view of Lagos is a city that is already living in the future, and where all of us are gravitating towards sounds to some extent apocalyptic, right? So, I mean, can you please just reflect on that? Thank you.
Thanks, Obvious. Crispin?
Yes, Brandon, very, very interesting. I just have a question, given the complexity and the variability in as far as informality is concerned, from informal mining, informal trading, informal housing, informal sort of like in a way platform gig economy. So I just wanted to your framing, which is quite very interesting. How sort of like transposable or how sort of applicable is this sort of like framing across those different sort of like in a way complexities in terms of as far as informality is concerned, or maybe there's need to do some adjustment depending on the various sort of like in a way the complex given the complex nature of the livelihood or the activities that are sort of like in a way associated with informality. So how it's sort of like given your framework, how is it sort of like transposable, or how can applicable across those different complexities in as far as informality is concerned? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crispin. I don't know, maybe Brandon, I can throw in mine, and I'm sure maybe that this will be the last, unless maybe if there are any quick ones. Yeah, no, I like your work, and I really enjoy the framing. I've been working on second-hand clothing, and I think it's really huge in Zimbabwe and in Joburg, South Africa as well. And it's interesting in how you are framing this idea of informal world making, where we see, a huge and increasing number of people creating livelihoods within the gray areas of sustainability. which I think is something that's interesting, and speaking to the global commodity circulation, but also even the global circuits of consumption. So I think what we're seeing in Africa, if we see informal economies as increasingly sustained by this circulation of global north discarded commodities, such as second-hand clothes, all this e-waste that you're talking about. Should we understand informality not just simply as a local urban condition, but maybe as a global infrastructure that also absorbs the social and environmental contradictions of contemporary capitalism? I just wanted to pick your brain in relation to that. Then I think the second question that I also wanted to throw in relation to informal artisanal mining, and I think we can see from your work that informal artisanal miners are sort of an indispensable part of this global green transition through these critical mineral supply chains. And I just wanted to think and pick your brain with what this reveals about the hidden informal foundations of these supposedly sustainable and formal economies. So I think I'll just throw those two just to hear your views around that. Thanks, Brandon.
Brilliant questions. Thank you all for engaging substantively. I really appreciate it, and it's wonderful to have this dialogue where you really push to question, where I'm pushed to question my own arguments and develop them further. So I appreciate that. I think I'll begin with the first question, Jelis's question, and you bring up the case of Operation Murambatsvina, which I think is an excellent and obviously canonical case of urban displacement in Zimbabwe. And I think you extend it really nicely because you understand how the ZANU-PF mobilized a kind of a crackdown on informality associated with city settlement and urban control. Obviously, the opposition in Harare getting targeted so much, and the brutal treatment of informality, as in this case, a survivalist strategy, gets leveraged by ZANU-PF to essentially punish people for voting for the opposition party, or to try to compel them to vote for the ZANU-PF too. And I've done some work on this idea of unfunded mandates in Zimbabwe, where you actually see a purposeful, formal decentralization of urban governance control to the city level, but then so governments are given the mandate to govern without the funds to be able to actually do this. So in this case, informality from above, you get the instrumentalization of informality as a kind of a governance weapon to try to manufacture the outcomes that you're interested in. And so obviously I'm interested in urbanization and mining. So thinking about Operation Murambatsvina and the displacement of people from not only their houses, but their livelihoods, can also tie this to the increase in artisanal small-scale mining around the Marang diamond fields in Zimbabwe, work that I've done with Western Marume on this, where we actually link the displacement, the urban displacement from Operation Murambatsvina to artisanal small-scale mining, because people need to find a way to earn an income for themselves. And there's a whole long history of that that we try to document. And I think it's a really good point. And I think, coming back to the initial cases that I had on South Africa, on Zambia and Zimbabwe, I think across a lot of African contexts, this spatial connection between mining, displacement, state brutality, and urbanization is probably understudied. You also mentioned the heterogeneous nature. I think this is the tension that we're trying to get right. So when we say that informality is planetary, this is more that we're arguing that it's a more generalized phenomenon across space than we've realized. Not to say that the individual places are necessarily all the same. They obviously have their different local, contextual, and social variability. And so I think that one of the challenges to me and other people that may be interested in doing scholarship on informal infrastructure is to do justice to the local case, to the cultural specificities, to the political histories of that individual case, while also linking it up to the broader kind of planetary concerns that we have. The idea and the argument of informality is not to render all places the same through informality, but rather to understand how informality can be used as a conceptual abstraction in addition to an applied reality on the ground to kind of link these broader concerns across people and across place. Crispin's point on living with collapse, I think, is really good, right? These are the moral gray spaces of sustainability, also of the economy. And if I have to articulate exactly where I stand on that, it comes back to the heterogeneity of the initial point from Jealous, but also, where do I sit as a scholar? And I've always kind of tried to avoid boxing myself within a particular type of lens, right? I'm wary of assigning myself an ideology at the start of my work because then people pre-assume my positions based on that ideology itself. But if I have to define myself, I'll probably say I'm a critical pragmatist, right? I'm critical of capitalism. That doesn't necessarily make me Marxist, for example. But I am, I also have to be critical of the political and economic structures that render people so vulnerable and then punishes them for that vulnerability itself. So in some cases, yes, it is living with collapse. But also in some cases, I think we can understand informality as active world making, like not only people finding ways to survive and hopefully pursue upward mobility, but also to actively create an underpin to the whole global economy, whether it's through supply chains or whether through spatial production of the future of urbanization in the 21st century. So I'm somewhere in the middle, and I think obviously, for me, informality is so generative because it helps us embrace these kind of complex questions, but it also helps us be able to critique how and why informality, relates to the formal market. The informal-formal dialectic is one of my earlier papers, but it's really important for me because it tries to bring them together. So you often see scholarship on informality saying, informality and formality are not a binary, right? And that we owe a lot to Ananya Roy's work in the early 2000s. However, I think when I said that informality scholarship is spinning its wheels a little bit, I think we repeat that kind of argument again and again, but don't actually take it further. My piece, The Structure of Informality, the informal-formal dialectic in the Zambian Copper Belt, tries to take it further by saying, what do we do with that kind of argument? And I think the thing that we do with that argument is to try to show how the formal market, whether it's the formal city, whether it's the formal supply chain, is dialectically related to and engaged and actively produces informality. But informality obviously has its own impact on the formal market too. When it comes to secondhand clothing, Simba, I think that's a really, really cool idea. Ghana also has a lot of secondhand clothing that essentially gets dumped in the global south. And so I think linking the supply chains to the spatial manifestations is a really good example of how to do that, because when we kind of link the dumping of those secondhand markets, we're able to make a kind of a critique of the circular economy, but through a different kind of material. And when it comes to ASM, what does it reveal, right? I think it reveals that the kind of, and this will, I think, will have to be my last answer. It reveals, I think, structural dispossession by industrial mining companies to create the conditions where ASM is a rational response and reality for so many people. And so I can give two quick examples of this. In the DRC, the Swiss company Glencore has paid over $1.1 million in a settlement for trying to get active concessions for copper and cobalt in the Congo through bribery and manipulation of political system. The Chinese company CMOC Mining Company, they got the Tenke-Fungurume copper cobalt mine in the DRC by displacing around 10,000 people, ASM miners and ASM communities, from the active concession, and created massive plumes of sulfur dioxide, which actively puts people's health and well-being at tremendous risk, right? And they had to obviously also deal with the blowback from that. And I think, when we understand informality as a process, this process brings together these different types of actors, right? And I think when we try to have an idea of the complexities of informality and the informal paradox, we understand that this process actively creates the paradox that I'm keep referring to. And informal infrastructuring not only is an act of world making, somewhere sitting between the collapse and the generative resistance from the first question, and it's moving between those poles somewhere, but it also arms us with a tool when we look at informality in this way to actively try to hold to account the industrial mining companies or the urban policies that are creating that precarity in the first place. And you say, yes, we know there are problems associated with informal settlements, with informal labor, with informal mining. We know, no need to pretend that there aren't problems associated with it. But we can also look at how those problems are created and what they are a response to. And in my mind, in the mining case that I'm giving, the industrial mining companies, the corrupt Congolese political elite, and the global increased demand for these minerals are where we should orient our perspective to try to understand the kind of the structural planetary links that create that rational choice on the everyday, right? So the macro foundations of the micro practice itself. So that's why I brought in Baruwe at the beginning. So I'll probably leave it there. And thank you so much for all your time and attention, and also the opportunity to share this work with you all.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brandon. We really appreciate you making time to share your work with us, and very, very insightful work that you are doing there. I think it's quite important, and I think you could see the interest. We are almost into 2 hours, which I think speaks to the importance of the work and the engagement as well. So thank you very much, Brandon, and we'll definitely invite you again in the future because of the important work that you are doing, and how helpful it is for us to engage your work and learn from your work as well. And yeah, colleagues
Wonderful.
online, yeah, thank you very much, colleagues, for staying up to the very end and for engaging. We really appreciate that, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks a lot, Brandon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And if anyone wants the papers, if they're not open access, many of them are, they will be on ResearchGate, but also I can send you the PDFs if you're interested in kind of working with or engaging with, and always feel free to message. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I actually use some of your work as my readings for students, and I'm sure some of our colleagues here could find that work important as well. So thank you very much, Brandon, for your generosity and the importance of your work that you're sharing with us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Gupuruma. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for staying up to the end. We really appreciate. Do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, colleagues. Bye, Prof. Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues.